Why discuss the history of the British Empire now? When I was asked to do it, I wasn't really quite sure because the British Empire is long gone. Amazingly, about a week later, I happened to get a free copy of the Daily Telegraph, and there was an article which got a headline: "We must face up to our history if we want India on our side. Not everyone shares our rose-tinted view of the empire and what good or harm it did in the world." By someone called William Dalrymple, who's written lots of stuff about India, from a right-wing perspective, a liberal right-wing perspective. The debate over the legacy of the British Empire has become deeply and profoundly polarised. For some, such as the Indian parliamentarian Shashi Tharoor, whose book is here, the empire is a blot on world history comparable to slavery and fascism. For others, such as Niall Ferguson, Andrew Roberts or David Gilmour, all right-wing historians of various types, the Victorian administrators of the Indian civil service could certainly be fallible, but in fact represented, so Gilmour tells us, the British Empire at its best and most altruistic. What is not in dispute is that the empire was the most important thing the British ever did. We could talk about that. Anyway, he goes on to say, we remain particularly ignorant of the darker side of empire, and we are still taught in our schools that it is only our German enemies who turned racism into an ideology that justified mass murder. The Raj, the Indian regime under the British, we like to believe was like some merchant ivory film writ large over the plains of Hindustan, all parasols and similar tea parties, elephants and maharajas. My own position is that there are many things the British can be proud of, but these have to be weighed against a long succession of war crimes, etc. Final sentence. We need to learn the bad as well as the good if we are to make India the vital post-Brexit partner that it should be. And that's why we need to talk about the British Empire, because there are deluded Tories like Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, who does believe, in a sort of way, that if Britain leaves the EU, that we can rebuild the empire in some kind of way, and harks back to the golden age of British rule upon the world. And it is amazing, isn't it, that after the negotiations over Brexit, which are starting now, one of the issues on the table is the Rock of Gibraltar, one of the last remaining fragments of the British Empire. And wasn't it Peter Robinson, the loyalist politician? Shall I just wait for people to sit down?
Yeah. Hold on a minute.
There's some seats down the front if you want to come in, so we can close the door and carry on.
And I think it was the loyalist Ulster Unionist politician Peter Robinson, hardline unionist, who urged Protestant loyalists in Northern Ireland to apply for passports from the Irish Republic in order to keep their rights to remain in the EU. Nobody predicted Peter Robinson would be doing that. Now, Theresa May, you may remember, after the knife attack that happened on Westminster Bridge, said this in Parliament: "We meet here in the oldest of all parliaments because we know that democracy and the values it entails will prevail. Those values of British free speech, liberty, human rights and the rule of law are embodied in this place," Parliament. Now, we know Theresa May is a hypocrite of the worst kind anyway, but she's also probably an ignorant moron. The empire, the British Empire, was founded on the denial of basic rights, severe oppression, military subjugation and mass murder on a massive scale. And the point of this meeting is not to get theoretically complicated, but to give you an idea of the scale of the British Empire and its crimes, because we might need to remember these things in the debates coming up. We know that ever since the rise of civilizations, there have been empires, and they've all been brutal in one form or another, because minority classes and groups have held power over their subjects. But the British Empire was particularly brutal and nasty, and for a time, 100, 150 years, very, very successful, supremely successful. But that brutality was not due to some innate British characteristic, although it developed a racist, oppressive and vicious ideology which was deliberately stoked up, especially in the institutions like Eton and the public school system, in Sandhurst in the military training camps, and in the Church of England. And the empire's brutality and rapid spread was because this particular empire, the British Empire, was entwined with the rise of capitalism and its creation imperialism and its explosion across the world from Northern Europe. Imperialism is a modern phenomenon. You may have been to other meetings about this, about 300 or 400 years old, and it arose from the triumph of capitalism over feudalism as it established itself initially in Northwest Europe. It's not just about powerful countries dominating the smaller countries. It is that and more, but critically, imperialism is about the clash between the powerful countries, between them in competition with each other, attempting to dominate the world economy in their own interests. And it's this competitive element of imperialism, the fight for domination, for resources, for markets and so on, which is the essence of imperialism and explains how the threat of war, the threat of severe oppression of peoples is built into the entire world system of capitalism from its very beginning. At its height, it's extraordinary when you think about it. I was going to try and get a map on here, but we can't get the internet connection, so don't worry about it. But at its height, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the global landmass, and 23% of the world's population were part of the British Empire. And it was said, and you could see it on the map if I'd got it up there, that the sun never set on the British Empire. It was a boast. The sun never sets on the British Empire because we control every fucking where. Yeah, we dominate the world. And it happened because of a series of wars with other European colonial powers in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially the French, and Britain became an extraordinary naval power with a global reach. And they invented whole new methods of dealing with other people. One of them was called gunboat diplomacy, which sounds quite almost friendly, but was basically an 18th century version, a 19th century version of shock and awe. The ship would arrive off the port and bomb the crap out of it, and then the troops would go in and take control. But the main reason that the history of the British Empire is so bloody is not because of the British particularly, but because there was always resistance. Always, from day one, there was resistance to these invaders from abroad, and that resistance was sometimes on a gigantic scale. I want to give you some stories about that, and invariably put down by a combination of lies and chicanery on one side, but what they call diplomacy, and they teach you that in public school, and the bribing of indigenous and local rulers who threw in their lot with the foreign invader, and sheer bloody military force. Just want to add here, and I'm going to come back to this at the end if I get time, I need to add that Britain was never totally united in its project to dominate the globe. There was always opposition at home, and it was the radical 19th century Chartist leader, workers' leader called Ernest Jones, who coined the phrase, "the blood never dried on the British Empire." Now, there's no way in a talk like this that I can cover everything. I'm not going to mention North America and all that happened there, Canada, the Caribbean. I'm not going to mention Australasia and the genocide of the Aborigines, New Zealand. I'm not going to go all around the world telling everything. I'm going to try and pick on 2 or 3 big events to try and show how the British Empire worked. And I'm going to start with slavery. Britain joined the slave trade in 1670, and the super profits created by that trade provided the capital to turbocharge the growth of the new capitalist industries that were just starting to develop in Britain, and it was a big boost to economic changes that were already going underway as people were being pushed off the land into the cities to create the factory system that became known. But the slave trade was massive, it was incredibly profitable, and estimates vary, but something like 10 to 15 million Africans were forcibly transported from West Africa to the Americas. A huge proportion, 2 or 3 million, died on the way. The people who got there were tortured, worked to death, massacred. The life expectancy of a sugar plantation slave in Jamaica was roughly 7 years after arrival. They were forced to produce raw materials for the new booming British industries: cotton, sugar cane, tobacco, gold mined. And all the British banks and many of the household names of capitalist corporations had their origins in slavery. And many of the richer families in this country, the Camerons, for example, had their origins in the money made from slavery. Now, complication. The triumph of capitalism had been accompanied by high-minded principles in the ideological battles to defeat the old stultifying order of feudalism where everyone knew their place. Capitalism was born with revolutionary slogans like equality, liberty, fraternity, all men are created equal. Stark contrast to the barbarity, the direct barbarity of slavery. In order to justify this barbarity in their own minds, to justify the slavery, which by the way was the most profitable industry known to humankind ever by that point, a whole new ideology was created in a relatively short space of time called racism. The concepts of inequality and liberty did not apply to black people because they were an inferior species. Black people were no better than animals and should be treated as property, just like animals. So the first great legacy of the British Empire and of British imperialism is racism. And over the past 300 years, racism has mutated. It's changed in different ways to justify what our rulers do in different places to divide potential opposition. But racism became the key ideological buttress to the whole project of empire and colonialism. And it was the British slave trade and it was the ideological justification for the British slave trade that invented and institutionalized that cancer of racism. A spin-off of the slave trade and another great historical legacy has been the pauperization of Africa. Prior to the arrival of the Europeans and the slave trade, many African societies were as advanced as the Europeans, often more so, with centres of culture and learning. The European monks and dissident intellectuals from bits and pieces of the church in Northern Europe who took the initial steps towards challenging the ideologies of feudalism and the Dark Ages got their inspiration in many cases from the great Muslim universities based in the Moorish Empire in Spain, Cordoba and places like that, and the centres of learning across Africa, and they were amazed by cities like Timbuktu, for example, in West Africa. Before the slave trade, Africa had a population, continental population of about 50 million. 50 million and 12 million were robbed. That's quite a high percentage, a quarter of the population in the space of 100 years or so. Mostly young, mostly healthy adults, and it's estimated another 25 million were displaced. So the African society was destroyed by the process of the slave trade and then later carved up by the European powers, much later. But I want to talk about that now just for a second. In 1885, the European powers held a conference in Berlin and they were agreeing the division of Africa. They didn't want to come to war with each other over Africa, although that was a real threat because they were all piling in. So to avoid the conflict and the war, they parcelled up Africa, and it was divided up between the various European powers within 15 years. There were colonies all the way around Africa, except for one, by the way, just as an aside, Ethiopia, who defeated the Italians were given Ethiopia, but the Italians were defeated in a battle in 1898, which I'm not going to go into. That's a whole other story. Maybe we should have a meeting next year on that one. That's a good story in and of itself. And the legacy of colonialism in Africa was many-fold. Domestic agriculture, subsistence agriculture was deliberately destroyed. Mining was expanded massively, but what sensible person, a peasant, would go down a mine? What sensible person would do that? The reason they got people to go down there was because the British invented a new kind of system of taxation called poll taxes, head taxes, hut taxes, all brought in by the British to be paid in cash, and if you didn't pay in cash, on pain of death. That happened in many places, and therefore people were pushed into paid wage labour in the mines and on the plantations. And how did a few white colonialists manage to rule over millions of people and do this savagery? Divide and conquer was one of them. The British became experts in buying off local leaders, sometimes even inventing local leaders and then buying them off in order to try and divide opposition to them when they arrived. And wherever they needed to, the British created and stoked up conflict and played groups off against each other, ethnic groups, possibly religious groups, but they were always looking for ways to divide people out. And this was a conscious strategy developed over hundreds of years to create division and enable them to rule from a minority position. And if this didn't work, they had another alternative. It was called a gun, lots of them, and they developed the first repeating guns and machine guns to do that, and they wiped people out. Final point about this, and this happened all the way around the British Empire. The destruction of indigenous agriculture and industry created the space for new economic development by by and for the British, but only for the benefit of the colonial powers. So, for example, in Africa, all the roads and railway lines lead from somewhere to the coast. You can't get across Africa. It's still difficult to get across Africa. Even airlines are focused somewhere else. It's actually difficult to get across Africa. The point wasn't to use the railways to unite people and new technologies to unite people. It was designed to get the resources out as fast as possible. By the way, in the middle of all this, in the mid-19th century, in the 1860s, the British and the French built the biggest infrastructure project of the 19th century, huge infrastructure project, called the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal had nothing to do, and was massive, I don't know how long it is, hundreds of miles or whatever, maybe not hundreds, but a long way, huge canal, joining the Atlantic Ocean through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. The point was to be able to move goods around quickly and troops quickly. And one of the things when you read these books about the British Empire is quite extraordinary. You see an individual who's involved in putting down peasants in Ireland, then a few years later he's involved in a massacre of the Cherokees somewhere up in North America, and then a decade later ends up in putting down a rebellion by convicts in Australia. The British Army moved their officers around, putting revolt down all the time, and they needed to do that quite quickly. The Suez Canal was part of that. So these new societies, based on supplying the empire, agricultural and mining monocultures created, which left the societies completely dependent on the price fluctuations decided by a bunch of ex-public school boys on the European stock exchanges, especially in the city of London. So the whole world economy was shaped around supplying the various empires, and the British were the most successful. So I'm just going through all that because when you see reports of famine in Sudan or somewhere else in Africa, they never tell you about any of that. It's all about the poor benighted Africans who can't look after themselves. They never tell you about 100 years, 200 years, 300 years of barbarity that's brought us to the situation where this kind of thing can happen. So, the legacy of British Empire and imperialism in Africa was degraded, unbalanced, distorted economies, poverty on a mass scale, and deliberately created sectarian and tribal divisions. And do you know what? Africa was not unique. They did it bloody everywhere, and the stories are very similar. In Ireland, as I mentioned, divide and conquer, brutal repression, deliberate use of famine to starve people out. I want to talk a little bit about India, the jewel of the British Empire. When the British started its colonisation of India through a multinational corporation called the East India Company, an early version of a public-private partnership, India's share of the world economy was as large as the whole of Europe. 23% of world GDP was in India. This is a quote from a British missionary who arrived in India around that time. Nearly every kind of manufacture or product known to the civilized world, nearly every kind of creation of man's brain and hand existing anywhere and prized either for its utility or beauty had long been produced in India. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or any other in Asia. Her textile goods, the fine products of her looms in cotton, wool, linen and silk were famous over the civilized world. So were her exquisite jewellery and her precious stones cut in every lovely form. So were her pottery, porcelain, ceramics of every kind, quality, colour and beautiful shape. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great engineering works. She had great merchants, great businessmen, great bankers and financiers. Not only was she the greatest shipbuilding nation, but she had great commerce and trade by land and sea which extended to all known civilized countries. Such was the India which the British found when they came. And when they left, 200 years later, India's share of the world economy had dropped to 3%. This involved, for example, just one example, is a key example, the destruction of the most advanced textile industry in the world at the time, using hand looms, lots of them, individuals, artisans, earning massive export revenues and trade across the world. The British were absolutely ruthless in crushing this industry. They squeezed out the foreign buyers and instituted a monopoly on all trade. They refused to pay in pounds and foreign cash. They only paid in local currency and then forced the prices down. By controlling the ports, they cut off all Indian export markets, and they bought Indian raw cotton, which was still being produced, exported it to the new British textile industries, and then flooded back with very cheap factory-produced textiles back into India and across the world. That did a lot of damage, as you can imagine, to the Indian textile industry. But just to cap it off, British soldiers from the East India Company systematically smashed up all the looms of the weavers and broke their thumbs to prevent them working. In the great centre of Indian textile production in Dhaka, which is now part of Bangladesh, in the space of 60 years, the population of Dhaka, a main textile producing area at the time, one of the biggest textile producing areas in the world, the city dropped in 60 years from 500,000 to 50,000. And destitution for millions as they were essentially forced back onto subsistence farming outside. Now, this wasn't a case of artisanal craft production being squeezed out by superior methods of modern mass-produced capitalist factory machinery. This was an organised, institutionalised destruction of an industry to boost the British textile industry and to create the horrors of the modern factory system outlined by Dickens and Engels and various other peoples, in which British workers were forced off the land and forced to work in hellholes in the factories of northern England. And to enforce this rule, the British carried out massacre after massacre, instituted torture similar to the slave trade. Here's one example. Where's it gone? This is what the British Empire did, Theresa May. Searing with hot irons, dipping in wells and rivers till the victim is half suffocated, squeezing the testicles, putting pepper and red chilies in the eyes or introducing them into the private parts of men and women, prevention of sleep, nipping the flesh with pincers, suspension from the branches of trees, imprisonment in a room used for storing lime. That was all over the place. This was the British Empire. Abu Ghraib's got nothing on this. Abu Ghraib's got nothing on that. Mass hanging was used as a form of punishment against revolt. In his book, this one, I'd recommend you read it. Well, it's hard work reading these books because it's a catalogue of horror. It's a catalogue of horror done in the name of the British Empire. Newsinger cites one case after the defeat of a great revolt in India in 1857, when 130 men were found hanging on one big tree. It was hanging was a major form of getting rid of punishing people who revolted. Because in 1857, there's not a lot talked about this. It comes out in his book. There was a revolutionary uprising inside India against the British Empire. It's called the Mutiny, the Great Mutiny. And they attempted to set up a self-government involving 45 million people, probably the biggest ever revolutionary movement of the 19th century, actually. Very, very big movement. And it was only defeated by the British after a 6-month war, bringing in large numbers of troops to smash it up. And they did it because the British had better firepower, and the Indian rebels were disorganised and made tactical errors, which he goes through in the book. The retribution was swift and utterly brutal. Hundreds of thousands of Indians were massacred. Whole towns were sacked and destroyed. And I want to mention, which I've got to do it, a new form of execution, or a form of execution favoured by the British, especially against rebel Indian soldiers. I'm going to do this because we need to know the truth. It's called the Tallinn Aid. And here's a description by a British soldier writing home to his mother in aftermath of 1857. The prisoners were marched up to the guns. Their irons were knocked off, and they were lashed to the muzzles with drag ropes, the muzzles pointing just between their shoulders. When they says guns, he means cannons. I shut my eyes for half a second, and the guns exploded with one report. I could hardly see for the smoke for about 2 seconds, when down came something with a thud about 5 yards from me. This was the head and neck of one of the men. You can't imagine such a horrible sight. On each side of the guns, about 10 yards, lay the arms torn out at the shoulders. Under the muzzle and between the wheels lay the remainder of the bodies with the entrails scattered about. The heads had flown up in the air and fallen in the rear of the guns. I would never have imagined bodies would go to pieces so easily. This was the British Empire. This was driven by the people in the House of Commons and elsewhere who were managing this British Empire. And of course, in the process, vast riches were made. It wasn't just the complete reshaping of world trade in the interest of British capitalist profits and the direct transfer of huge amounts of wealth over 200 years. A French ambassador described the directors of the East India Company as richer than the kings of Europe. Robert Clive, an individual involved, a British soldier involved, later famously known as Clive of India. They've probably made films about him, actually. If they haven't, they will. Personally became a multi-millionaire, and he and other family members became members of Parliament by buying rotten boroughs. And then he acquired a peerage in Ireland based on the loot that he ripped off in India personally. This was corruption and looting on the grander scale, and it was absolutely massive. And it's no wonder that the British upper classes and even some of the middle classes were enthusiastic about sending their sons off to serve God, king and country. Lord Clive was just one tiny example of a whole class of gangsters and state-sponsored murderers who ran the empire and sat in the Houses of Parliament. This is some of the real history of the mother of all parliaments, Mrs. May. So, India, a country known for its self-sufficiency in food, faced repeated famine. It's estimated 30 to 35 million Indians died during famines under the British. In the Bengal famine of 1943, we're moving forward into the Second World War, 3.5 million people dead, Indians dead, despite the company producing enough food for itself. They were exporting rice in order to fund the war effort in the Second World War. I'm going to have to speed up here, very similar to the famine in Ireland. So, one other thing I just would like to inform you about, in case you didn't know. Britain was then, and probably remains, the biggest drug dealer in the history of the world. Huge levels of production of opium in Bengal, part of the Indian colony, organised and boosted and pushed by Britain. They organised massive state-sponsored smuggling of opium into China by Britain's biggest companies. A company like P&O Shipping Line, you've probably heard of it, made its money from the opium trade into China, and the profits from that were on the scale of the slave trade, and they financed the British Navy and the Empire's military occupation of India. They also helped to build the Suez Canal. When the Chinese government, which was a weak government, I can't go into it, attempted to stop this destructive trade, Britain went to war, not to impose the opium trade. And they went to war twice, and they imposed the trade. You will accept our opium, or we're going to destroy your cities. And that's what they did. And they got Hong Kong as part of that as well, by the way, just as a minor additional thing. At this point, I just want to give a special mention to a hero of the British imperialists, and probably Theresa May, and who attempted throughout his life to prevent the end of empire during the 20th century, a man called Winston Churchill. And this gives a flavour. Remember what I talked about, the ideology of racism from slavery? This gives a flavour of what's going on here. He famously responded to criticism of British policy in India in World War II, which led to the death of 3.5 million Indians. Churchill said, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." There's a Churchill film coming out as well, isn't there? I've seen the adverts I've seen the posters for it. I wonder if that's going to be in there. I somehow doubt it. So, British imperialism eventually declined, rocked by being weakened by 2 world wars in the 20th century. I can't go into all that, but also, especially at the end of the Second World War, huge scale of revolt. In India, massive revolt. Across Africa, huge revolts against the British Empire, and the British had to withdraw. And they were overtaken by new major powers, America particularly, but also Russia, the Soviet Union. So at the end of the World War II, Britain attempted to become an equal partner with the Americans to control the globe, control the empire and so on, the bits that were still there, and it's still large at the end of the Second World War, but this was blown apart by the 1956 Suez Crisis, when the Egyptian government nationalised the Suez Canal, this great infrastructure project, and the British and French went, what? Invaded in an alliance with Israel, but the Americans, for their own reasons, which I'm not going to go into, stopped them, and Britain, the game was up for Britain. Britain didn't have the reach anymore. They were no longer the global power they wanted to, and the empire unravelled pretty quickly after that. And I think the position of Britain with America is far from equal, as we know, and I think summed up by the instruction that Tony Blair's Chief of Staff gave to the new British ambassador in Washington in 1997, which was, get up the arse of George Bush and stay there. That's under a Labour government. But that actually wasn't an aberration. The Labour Party grew up as a national force after the First World War, and then as a serious party of government. It had been in party and government a bit before the Second World War, but seriously after the Second World War. That's when Labour sort of was a golden age of the Labour Party as it grew. Labour rose as the empire declined. And the record of Labour in this situation was quite bad, in fact, at times appalling. Look, reformism within capitalism is really only possible in the long term as capitalism expands. As capitalism expands, people can fight for the reforms and reformist organisations can provide reforms. And Labour has always seen its role essentially as saving capitalism from itself and saving the system from revolt from below because we will provide for the workers. And as the empire played such a crucial economic role as the empire played such a crucial economic role in Britain as a whole, Labour was at best ambivalent and often really bad on empire. In 1924, the first ever Labour government, a fantastic step forward, with a trade unionist in as the new first ever Labour colonial secretary. They were called a colonial secretary then. And he said in his first few days, "I'm here to see that there is no mucking about with the British Empire. And over India, Labour conferences voted to support independence, but Labour governments completely ignored them." Clement Attlee, in the 1942, I think it was, 43, was chairing a cabinet committee in the middle of the Second World War that decided to put in prison the leaders of the Indian national movement, Gandhi, Nehru and the others, because of the war effort. And he was doing his part for British imperialism in that war effort. Over Palestine and the creation of Israel, very much to do with the carve-up of the Middle East by the big powers, particularly Britain and France, at the beginning of the 20th century, Labour has always been Zionist. In Malaya in 1948, a Labour government attempted to crush a nationalist, left-wing, communist-influenced movement that was fighting for independence and reforms, including hanging the General Secretary of the trade union movement and interning tens of thousands of leftist oppositionists. In Kenya, the policies of a Labour government triggered a great Mau Mau uprising, which was brutally crushed by the incoming Tories who came in 1951. Here is what Tribune, the left-wing Labour newspaper, wrote in 1948, which sums up the kind of general approach of the left. "We want to stay in Africa, both for our own purposes and in the interests of the African peoples. Africa offers huge natural resources which can be exploited for the benefit of Britain and the world. We do not need to apologise for our mission in Africa. Whatever the reason which took our forebears there, we must stay." Contrast that with the textile workers in the first factories in northern England who supported the fight against slavery. Contrast that with Ernest Jones and the radicals in the 19th century Chartist movement who supported Irish freedom and denounced imperial adventures in India and elsewhere. Or William Morris, a founder of the Marxist tradition in Britain, opposed to imperialism and colonialism. Or the radicalised militants who came out of the First World War, active against the war in the First World War. They were inspired by the Russian Revolution, and then they went on to form the new Communist Party in Britain around 1920-21. They opposed colonialism and empire, and more than that, they actually campaigned actively in solidarity with the liberation movements, especially in Africa and India. So there's always been a strong strand of anti-imperialism in Britain, and that's the tradition we stand in. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Just to sum up, a final point to think about. Jeremy Corbyn has also been part of the anti-imperialist wing of the working class movement in this country. He's a man of principle. We've known him for many, many years. He's been good on virtually all the key questions around imperialism. And as he gets closer to number 10, the quicker the better, the pressure to conform is going to grow. And it's an open question, I'd say. It's an open question. Will he slide back into the traditional Labour camp, or will he stick to his principles and deliver a really quite historic break with the past? An anti-imperialist prime minister in the country of the British Empire, that would be something. That would be something. So the pressure on him, personally, and on his politics and the party, Labour Party, will be absolutely enormous. Enormous. It's a significant historical breaks. And in this situation, our approach is quite simple. And what we do, because of the political turmoil taking place, what we do and say actually matters. And what we say, we expose the hypocrisy, lies and double standards of imperialism and the history of the British Empire. The existence of British imperialism is a barrier to progress for humanity, and the task of ourselves and the left is to smash it.